Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prananatha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam dantaye yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambujo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haiturastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Vrajendhum Shri Rupa Chintamala Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Nirupa Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir ya Nikilarta Varga Janani ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandati Shaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Brajaloka Vad Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Namah Yas Ramya Nikilagha Sangha Shamani Shrutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pāda. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. We're here in the Prakaran on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma, and we're discussing the first portion of the first verse in this section, which discusses how the deity of Sri Bhagavan is to be seen. So we've, in the last reading, gone into a section from the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, where Sanatana Gosvami cites the verse under discussion, and also gives some extended discussion of ideal and non-ideal manners of deity worship and the differing results that they produce in terms of quality and efficiency, or in terms of when they produce which results. So today we should conclude that discussion. So we've discussed previously the verses that he refers to, which appear to speak of deity worship as a lesser approach than others, or something made or done by those who are of lesser education or lesser maturity. So now he's resolving that, and in this discussion he'll show what ultimately is the benefit of doing deity worship both with and without an ideal understanding of how it's meant to be done. So I've got a fresh file in the folder, and I'll be starting from the top of that. So, Sri Gopakumar accepts the aforecited answer from Sri Narada, but still considers that the statements in the Puranas that speak as if to indicate inferiority on the part of deity worshippers must refer to some particular form of deity worship, because such statements otherwise would not exist in the Puranas, given that the Puranas are statements of mahats, and thus cannot be considered erroneous or superfluous. Sri Narada therefore clarifies the intended reference of these statements as follows. So he states the following. Those specifically, however, who worship a new image of him with thought of the image being stonen and so on, and thus with a vision of distinction, quote, this is a dwelling place of Hari. That is, this is not Hari himself, but rather a separate object, a mere image made of stone or another material, in which we are imagining Hari to be present. Number 2, those who do not honor his bhaktas, those who are, number 3, disrespectful towards all living beings, and 4, those who transgress Prabhu's order in the form of the Vedas, out of pride in their aforesaid worship, are the least of all bhaktas. They are of meager intelligence, since they certainly do not attain the result of worship as it is described in the Shastra. So in answering the question, when there are times when deity worship is spoken of as being something done by the immature or something done by the lesser qualified, then that's referring to this. In other words, that's referring to worship in which one thinks the deity is not Bhagavan, it's just an arbitrary object, an arbitrary image that we're considering to be a place where Bhagavan is present. And on top of that, we'll worship that, but we won't worship other bhaktas of Bhagavan, we won't respect the presence of Bhagavan in other living beings, and we won't have regard for the teachings of the Shastra about how this worship is meant to be performed, or how living beings are meant to be respected, or how bhaktas are meant to be served, and so on. So someone is doing some type of worship of Bhagavan, but with this lack of attunement, or with these other attitudes which are non-ideal. So he's saying that the persons who do the worship in this way don't get the result that is described in the Shastra. So here, Sri Narada refers to and summarizes the primary characteristics of the manner of worship described in the aforecited verses from Srimad Bhagavatam, which we discussed in the previous classes, thus clarifying that such statements are not meant to be construed to refer to all forms of deity worship, but rather only to deity worship performed with the aforesaid defects in vision and conduct. Furthermore, noteworthy specifically in relation to the meaning of the statement in the verse under discussion, quote, one who in regard to a deity of Viṣṇu has the thought of a stone, is situated in Naraka, arcye viṣṇau śilā naraki, is the ensuing explanation by Sri Narada of the ultimate outcome of the worship performed with the aforesaid defects. So this is the interesting part. In other words, I think for many of us, we've heard teachings like this many times. We're well aware of the importance of honoring bhaktas, of respecting other people, or other living beings, of thinking the deity not to be an arbitrary image, but rather to be a manifest form of Bhagavan. So what's significant here is even if someone lacks all of this understanding, what is the effect of them doing, quote unquote, doing it wrong? If they do this wrong worship, what's going to happen as a consequence? So this is what he says next. So this is another following passage in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. Quote, a result even of that worship on their part, which is superior to the result of all varieties of right action on the path of karma, and excellent, certainly ensues of its own accord. So here, this is perhaps surprising, or to say, okay, all these lack of proper worship and lack of proper understanding, doing worship with that lack of proper conduct and that lack of proper understanding will produce an excellent result, and a better result than you could ever get by following the process of karma well. Really? Even if you do, in other words, this path, this process of bhakti is so sublime, even when you do it wrong, you get a better effect than doing a lesser path, ideally or rightly. So how is that? That will be explained. And the other critical factor here is, when does this excellent result happen? So he says, still, the result in keeping with bhakti to Bhagavan does not manifest. That is, they do not attain prema for Sri Bhagavan's lotus feet, thereby attain his domain, and thereby attain the ultimate result in keeping with performance of bhakti to Bhagavan, namely forever meeting, sporting, and so forth with Sri Bhagavan in his domain in the spirit of prema. So he's saying that if people do this deity worship without this right understanding and right practice, then they'll get a benefit that's great, that exceeds the benefit they could get on the path from following the path of karma. But they won't get the benefit of properly following the path of bhakti. In other words, how you follow the path of bhakti matters. Following it improperly will not produce the same benefit as following it properly. So you won't get the benefit of properly following the path of pure bhakti. But you'll still get an excellent result that's better than following the path of karma, even more accurately according to its rules, than following this path of bhakti according to its own rules. So thus, those two, that is, the worship in the manner described in these previous verses and its result, here and there, meaning in the Puranas and various other places, is condemned by the best of sadhus. That is, those who are one-pointed upon Bhagavan, meaning those who aspire for the ultimate result of bhakti to him. So why is bhakti performed improperly belittled in some cases? It's belittled by people who want you to follow the path of bhakti accurately, not people who want to diminish the process of deity worship so that you go follow some other path and give up the process of deity worship. It's rather doing it improperly is said to be detrimental because you're far better off doing it properly. So thus, to construe the Bhagavatam as not actually favoring the process of deity worship would be what Sanatana Gosvami is trying to negate, and say rather the Bhagavatam is thoroughly in favor of it, and in places where it seems to belittle it, it's actually only trying to belittle the improper practice of it to guide people in practicing it in an ideal manner. So here, Sri Narada explains that the result of such worship is condemned from the perspective of those following the path of pure bhakti, because such worship is not conducive to success on the path of bhakti. Yet, because no form of worship of Sri Bhagavan ever goes in vain, and rather anything in connection with Bhagavan will always have some special benefit in comparison to activities not directly related to him, such worship will still produce results that are even greater than those produced by observance of the path of karma. So, as Krishna advises, Yeyatamam prapadyate tang sataiva bhajamyaham, as you approach me, so I will reciprocate with you. And as he encourages people, whatever you want, come to me for it. Better to come to me for whatever you seek than to pursue it exclusive or excluding me. So even if you don't want me, even if you don't want what's really good for you, still if you come to me for that, I'll favor you. I'll give you a little more than what you would have got if you hadn't come to me for it. So this is a sweet consideration that Bhagavan is, suhridam sarvabhutanam, the friend of every living entity. And the commentators on that verse in the Gita, they explain that to mean nirapeksha hit akankshi, which means who is an impartial well-wisher of every living being. Means he always wants well for all. Even if you go wrong, even if you don't listen to him, even if you don't do as he might advise, nevertheless, he, without any judgment, will want you to wish you well and favor you in your pursuit. So this is what's being shown, that even doing it wrong will still benefit you more so than doing some other process that's less related to him right. But nevertheless, better still is doing this in a way that leads to the fullness of relation with him. So Sri Narada then further clarifies the intended reference of the aforecited verses that speak of deity worship as a lesser form of sadhana. Quote, you should also consider all those particular statements from the Puranas and elsewhere, meaning those that we discussed earlier, to be related to them in particular, that is, to those who engage in worship of an image in the aforementioned inapt manner, and not rather to everyone, that is, to all worshippers of an image of Bhagavan. So he's clarifying and saying, where deity worship is spoken of as lesser, that doesn't refer to all performers of it, it refers to this specific class. So, that point I think was already clear from the earlier discussion, but here it comes out more explicitly in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. So now Gopakumar raises another layer of consideration in this regard. So this is from the tika that precedes or is the introduction to the following verses in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. So Gopakumar says, well, still, such an insignificant result, that is the attainment merely of an exceedance of worldly wealth, power, privilege, and so on, as is had by those who follow the path of karma, is certainly not befitting for worshippers of Bhagavan by whatever means, that is, regardless of their performing worship of him in an inapt manner. As per the statement in Vishnu Puran, quote, O Maitreya, for one whose mind is absorbed in japa, homa, archan, and so on in relation to Vasudeva, attaining the result of being the king of the devas, namely Indra, and so on, is only an impediment. So this is spoken from, so Gopakumar is speaking further from the perspective of the path of pure bhakti. So from the perspective of pure bhakti, only the attainment of prem, only the attainment of seva to Bhagavan is of true value, and even achieving wealth or peace or status or what have you within the worldly context is not perceived to be of any net benefit or net actual value. So he's saying, okay, you're saying deity worship benefits everyone and gives them these worldly benefits more so than if they followed the path of karma, but does that really even help people if they can achieve the status of being Indra or achieving some great worldly status? Isn't that also just a further impediment to them ever attaining pure bhakti? So is that really even beneficial? And what's the value of that anyway? This is the objection. So Gopakumar's point here is that although it was said that the deity worship of persons who lack the proper understanding and conduct required for it on the path of pure bhakti, nevertheless attain greater results than those who follow the path of karma, still, even such results are not really supremely beneficial for such persons. And anyone who worships Bhagavan even improperly in ignorance ought not receive anything less than a result that leads to their ultimate well-being. So if Bhagavan really cares about people, and people are worshipping him wrongly, why does he just give them what they want? Why doesn't he give them really what's good for them? And, we've discussed in earlier classes the statement in the 5th canto, I forget how it goes, but, it states that, Bhagavan ultimately gives people what they want, but not in a way that causes them to repeatedly desire more things, and rather he gives them his own seva or his own feet such that they no longer desire anything else. He gives them, in other words, what's truly good for them rather than just what they want. So elsewhere in the Bhagavatam we have this understanding. So Gopu Kumar's Purva Paksha could be, so to speak, a restatement of these other considerations in the Bhagavatam, that as the true Nirapita Akankshi, or well-wisher of all living beings, it doesn't mean just giving them what they want, but really giving them what's good for them. So, to allay this concern, Sri Narada further explains how such persons ultimately attain the highest benefit, as was implied in the aforementioned comment of Sri Samipad on Bhagavatam 11.247, explained by Sri Jiva in his commentary on Bhagavatam 3.29-22, and stated boldly by Chakravartipad in his commentary on the same verse. So those are things we discussed earlier. So I'm also just showing how Sanatana Gosvami, in this whole unfolding of the principles in the Bhagavatamrita, gives a teaching which the other commentators gave directly in their Bhagavatam commentaries in those contexts. So, that is as follows. If they, who perform worship in the aforesaid manner, that is, in the improper manner described in these verses we've already discussed, shall assuredly not forsake even that manner of worship under any circumstance. So in other words, even if they're doing it wrong, if they just keep doing it, then when their minds are purified by their fixity in that is, in such inapt worship, and they have all their faults destroyed by the grace of bhaktas of Krishna, who are observers in qualities in them rather than faults, they too, after some time, become most excellent, just as sakama bhaktas enjoy the desired result which they perform bhakti with a desire to attain, namely enjoyments of objects of the senses and the like, and in time, by the power of bhakti, attain that result which is befitting of bhakti to Bhagavan and beyond even what one can desire, as alluded to in the verses we discussed earlier, namely the result of attaining prema, entrance into Bhagavan's abode, and the privilege of sporting with him and so on. So what he's saying is that we've heard elsewhere in the Bhagavatam and other places that even when people worship Krishna with material desires, if they just actually continually worship him, even though the motivation is for something else, that fixity that they acquire in repeatedly conceiving of Bhagavan, speaking his name, hearing his name, seeing his form, making offerings to him, etc., that has a purifying effect over the psyche, which can ultimately efface the motivation for which one came to engage in those activities themselves. So as that unfolds, the person will attain both the thing that they were initially motivated to attain when they took up the act, but ultimately will attain the effect of performing worship with a purified psyche that became purified in the process of performing the worship while being motivated by something else. So what's really emphasized here is the purifying value of the practice and the fact that people will come to the path with all kinds of desires and all kinds of samskaras, and you can't expect them to be, anyabilashita shunya off the top. It's like essentially impossible. But if they stick to the process, if they maintain fixity in the activities, that will gradually reconstitute the samskaras that are predominant and are ultimately the driving motivation in their performance of the worship. So there's a profound benefit in engaging in the activity, in the practice, even if it's misunderstood or even if it's motivated in another way. So this is also, can give some peace of mind, so to speak, if people feel that, anarthas or something that seem like a hill they'll never climb over, or this, they perpetually feel as though they're discovering further layers of worldly motivation and attachment that seem like they'll never stop coming up, another layer of the onion, another layer of the onion, so to speak, then this statement and this perspective is affirming that may go on, but nevertheless, you should also go on. You should also continue to sustain fixity in the practice, and that will gradually have its effect. And one shouldn't, so to speak, excessively beat oneself up or even disqualify oneself because one lacks the full adhikar to do the practice ideally at this time. Even if one's adhikar is lacking, nevertheless, practice has value. So Sanatana Pada elaborates on this in his commentary. So here we get to the main nitty-gritty of the whole discussion. So to this objection, he speaks two verses, meaning the two we just quoted. Even worshippers of newly fabricated images of Bhagavan, with the thought of the images being stonen and so on, and thus a vision of distinction of the images from Bhagavan. Although they are following an erroneous path because of great conceit, although they are perpetrators of disrespect to living beings, and although they are they by whom Vaishnavas are disregarded, if they nonetheless shall assuredly not forsake that, even such a manner of worship under any circumstance, then when their minds are purified by their fixity in that worship, or by that fixity in worship, and they have had all of their faults, those of conceit and so on, destroyed, they too after some time, meaning indeed in a very short time, become most excellent, that is, possessed of pure bhakti. So these people who take up the process with a lack of proper understanding, a lack of proper respect, etc., if they stick to the practice, that will gradually purify them, and they'll eventually achieve pure bhakti. It is to be understood, furthermore, that those who after performing such worship, meaning worship thinking the deity is merely stone and so on, with damba, which you could take to mean arrogance or conceit or a combination of the two, and the like, meaning in a host of variety of other unfavorable attitudes, when the result of that worship is thereby attained, shall forsake that worship and also eventually become excellent, but only after a long time. So he's saying the real problem with these attitudes is not that they can actually eclipse the power of bhakti to benefit someone. They can't. The power of bhakti will eventually purify a person of those wrongful attitudes and behaviors. But it'll be slow going. It'll take a long time. So the sooner you can rectify those attitudes, the sooner you can rectify the conduct, the sooner the benefits, the sooner the attainment will come. But it's not that it won't come either. So this is the balance. There should be confidence in the ultimate assured purifying effect of the practice. And there should also be, as far as possible, an attempt to do the practice in an ideal manner as soon as possible. So a question is raised. Well, as a result of a parad to Vaishnavas born of disregard for them, how can such a result be attained by such persons who perform worship in such an inapt manner? So everyone will say, but if you commit aparad, you won't succeed in bhakti, and if you have this attitude of disregard towards Vaishnavas, then you'll make aparad, because sarva aparad are anadaratmak, as Jiva Gosvami said, the essential basis of every type of aparad is an attitude of disregard, or an attitude that lacks due regard for others, be it Vaishnavas or living entities in general, or deities or gurus or what have you. So as long as you have that attitude of anadar, or of a lack of regard, you're likely or prone or susceptible to committing aparad, and when you commit aparad, you won't succeed in bhakti. So how can you say that someone who still has the attitude that leaves them liable to committing aparad will nevertheless still succeed in bhakti? So to address that, the answer to this question is that it can be attained by the grace of those very mahats, whom such an inapt worshipper fails to duly regard. Thus he says, quote, by the grace of bhaktas of Krishna. So this is interesting. We hear a lot of stress on not offending Vaishnavas, and that, Vaishnava parad is like poison, and Vaishnava parad will lead to one's fall down and so forth. But here he's saying that even if someone lacks the proper attitude, because of that lack of proper attitude, even if someone commits offense because they don't show due regard for those Vaishnavas, then still that person will succeed because those Vaishnavas have a gracious disposition. Meaning because those Vaishnavas won't take offense at that offense, or they'll understand that the person is only acting this way because they're ignorant, or because they have, some unfavorable sanskar of some arrogant attitude, or towards arrogance or conceit, or what have you. So it's then inevitable that people will come into the proximity of Vaishnavas, into the cultural scope of these practices without a proper attitude. If they come into a place full of tender things without an understanding of how to treat them tenderly, inevitably they'll break something. There's a saying in English, a bull in a china shop. China meaning the fine type of cutlery and other types of plates and pots and things like this made out of easily breakable porcelain and so on. So a bull in a china shop means someone who has no idea that they're in the presence of some very delicate, very expensive things. So more or less, this is the situation of the world by the culture of bhakti being put out in the world of people filled with anadya vidya. You're essentially, building a temple is like putting up a china shop in a pasture full of bulls, if I may, So can you expect these bulls to understand what is China? Well, yes, you can, because they're not actually bulls, they're human beings with intelligence that can understand it. But can you expect them to immediately understand it? Can you expect them to, in a moment, or as soon as it's present, completely, reattune their behavior to this delicacy or to this fineness? Frankly speaking, no. So you would think then that the whole enterprise is actually impossible. So what makes the enterprise nevertheless possible, even when it's precarious? So the thing that makes it successful is simply the fact that Vaishnavas are gracious, that Vaishnavas will be forgiving, that Vaishnavas will still favor these people who are showing disregard essentially out of a lack of understanding for what they're dealing with. Just as, children are forgiving of the ignorance of parents are forgiving of the ignorance or misbehavior of their children because they know they're just kids. They don't really know better, or they're in the process of learning. So there's a necessity of rules and guidance and discipline, but at the same time, there's also the gracious disposition, the favoring disposition of the one in knowledge, of the one in the more advanced position, so to speak. So essentially what makes the entire process work, it all boils down to the fact that Vaishnavas will be patient and understanding of the learning curve that's required for people to come into this whole culture of bhakti. So a further objection is raised in this regard. And it says, well, the mahat's indifference or neglect towards them is proper. In other words, why should these mahats be gracious to these people who don't have due regard because they don't know what's what, or they're, have some sanskar for being excessively conceited? Why don't they just ignore them? Why should they be kind, or why should they favor these people who don't actually, so to speak, deserve or merit such treatment? So to that he says, or he describes the mahats as, quote, they who are observers of qualities, guna darshinam. So in other words, the disposition of the Vaishnava is to be a gunagrahi or a saragrahi, to grasp or to focus on the positive side of things, to focus on the qualities of things, or to grasp the essence of things. Doesn't mean that they're not aware of the faults, or that they don't see the faults, or that they're not aware of the implications of the faults, but it's that they overlook them, not that they don't see them at all. So I think I don't remember where I read it, but someone said somewhere that wisdom is not so much, it was something like, wisdom is to know what's important to overlook. Means it's one thing to see the good, the bad, the ugly, all sides of things, but wisdom is to see it all and then know what's really worth focusing on in the midst of all of that. So there's a statement in the Charitamrita in praise of Haridas Pandit where he's described as Vaishnavera Gruna Grahina Dekai Dosh Kayamana Vakya Kore Vaishnava Santosh. That with his body, mind, and words he would satisfy the Vaishnavas, seeing or appreciating their qualities and overlooking their faults. So we also hear at one place in the Sharta Darshani Chakravarti Pad, he describes Paramahamsas not as those who see qualities even in the midst of qualities and faults, but those who can appreciate even a semblance of qualities in a place where there are only faults. So, what we see, what we culture ultimately determines the state of mind, the so to speak, conscious environment that we live in. So the whole premise of Vaishnavism, of bhakti itself, is to culture the positive, relish the positive. So Vaishnavas have the tendency here of being gunadarshi, of seeing the qualities. So they'll see, oh look, this person is performing some worship. Maybe they think it's just a stone. Maybe they don't understand that Bhagavan is present in every living being. Maybe they don't know how great other Vaishnavas are. Maybe they don't understand anything. But look, they're doing some puja. Or look, they're singing some kirtan. Maybe some, in Western, nowadays in the West, or outside of India, you see kirtan being performed at all kinds of popular music festivals, or in mixed contexts where people have very little theological framework for what's being sung, or have a new age way of reconceiving of those things. So you might say, oh, this is all, a bunch of misunderstanding or something like that. But on the other hand, you can say, but look, they're still chanting. Like, there's something there. Maybe you can hear famous people, Western kirtaniyas, saying that when you chant Jai Bhagavan, you're actually chanting about the ultimate version that you will become, and you are Bhagavan. Chant Jai Bhagavan, thinking of your own greatness. You can hear famous people teaching this to people when they lead their kirtans, and some Vaishnava might cover his ears and say, oh God, when you chant Jai Bhagavan, at least don't think you're Bhagavan. At least think Bhagavan is whom you're trying to serve, and that you're his das, and that this is the whole premise of what is the essential nature of the jiva. To be a servant of Krishna, to be a servant of Bhagavan. And now you're going around telling people to chant Hare Krishna and chant Jai Bhagavan, thinking they're Bhagavan. You might say like that. Okay, fine, we might object to that from a theological viewpoint. But from the liberal perspective prescribed here, or described here, whether, it's talking about archan, and I'm saying we can apply this more broadly even to other limbs of bhakti as well, and say that even if they're doing these things with a different understanding, there's also some quality in that. There's also some, at least, tendency towards self-improvement, some tendency towards some type of refining culture that's beyond mere, sensual absorption, and so on and so forth. So that Vaishnavas have this tendency, or their general disposition, is to appreciate the quality in things, even if the quality bit is a minority within the element that's being observed, whatever it may be, that they can see the quality in things, they can appreciate that, and they can overlook what might be less respectful or less ideal. So the objection is given, why don't the Mahats just be indifferent to these people? Why should they be gracious to them? So the answer is given, because these Mahats, see qualities. Thus, the offense even of such persons, that is of inapt worshippers being described in these verses, is not taken by them. So the Vaishnavas don't take offense at the fact that these people might do things with an understanding that doesn't match with theirs, or that's not according to the siddhantas of the Shastra and all of this. Even if the people have a different understanding, or what might be perceived as an erroneous understanding, they don't take offense at that. Because, why not? This is the very important point. Because of their vision of Bhagavan in all things. In other words, because even that presence of that misunderstanding, and even that presence of this wrong action, that's also part of Bhagavan's reality. That's also part of the whole that we are a part of. We can't negate its existence. That they'll also see that as some arrangement that Bhagavan is also pervading, that Bhagavan is still present in the hearts of all of these people, even who have this lack of proper understanding or this lack of proper behavior, because they'll see at the root the presence of their Ishta Devata within whatever they come across. Then they understand there's no point in just turning away from this. If we really see the presence of Bhagavan in everything, if we really have that understanding that everything is part of Bhagavan, is going on by the, you may say distant or non-directly involved aspects of the cycling of various energies of Bhagavan and all of this, nevertheless, it still can be regarded as still something, so to speak, coming from Bhagavan, or coming about in the midst of all that belongs to Bhagavan. So even the presence of aparad, even the presence of wrongfulness, so to speak, is also existing. And so they will not take offense, because they'll see that this is all ultimately not something aimed at them, or not something that they should take personally, or that they should, make about themselves, but they should say, this is ultimately existing under the arrangement that Bhagavan is ultimately can be conceived of as being indirectly or broadly responsible for. So who am I to fault that by taking offense at that and saying that ought not be? Like, it is. So just accept it. So why take offense at it personally? So they don't. Rather, they see, this is happening. This is, ultimately an outcome of anadya vidya, an outcome of just the beginningless, causeless way that things are. And so they just accept it as it is and choose to be positive and choose to be gracious in response to it. So rather, only favor is shown. So they just favor those people, even though they're doing wrong, even though they don't understand. They still favor them. So only favor is shown to those inapt worshippers by the mahats, who overlook those worshippers' faults and rather appreciate the quality in them of performing worship, albeit inaptly. This is the purport. The implication of this conclusion is that even those described in the verse under discussion as, quote, situated in Naraka. So now this whole long thing in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva for 20 plus verses, what does that whole discussion say about the significance of the verse that we're commenting on here? Is this. The implication of this conclusion is that even those described in the verse under discussion as, quote, situated in Naraka, because they are, quote, one who is, in regard to a deity of Viṣṇu, has the thought of a stone, can eventually attain pure bhakti and the supreme purushartha, meaning prema, if they somehow receive the grace of a bhakta by, at the very least, sustaining nishta, or fixity, in their worship, even though it is being performed with an improper understanding and improper conduct. To conclude the matter, and finally clarify in what regard exactly the Shastra has thus condemned such improper worship, Sri Narada states the following. Furthermore, since the real result befitting of bhakti is not produced at that time in that case, meaning in an instance of a desire or sokam bhakti, that is condemned by those endowed with pure bhakti. So the condemnation of deity worship in all these aforesaid verses is only because of it not producing directly or efficiently the ultimate fruit of bhakti, of prema bhakti. So that's why it's condemned, not because it should not be done or because it can't lead to gradual benefit. The final understanding in this regard is thus that when one performs deity worship with the notion of the deity being merely a piece of stone, it will be a very long time before one attains the ultimate result of worship of Bhagavan, namely prema for Bhagavan and entrance into his lila. And thus such a person is said to be, quote, situated in naraka, that is, situated in a state of ignorance and suffering. If such a person sustains fixity even in inapt worship, however, they will ultimately be purified and supremely benefited by such worship of Bhagavan by virtue of the graciousness of mahats. As we've discussed, because those mahats will still favor them and support them, even as they struggle to learn and rectify their own ideas and activities along the way. The import of the verse under discussion is thus not that anyone who performs worship of a deity with the idea that the deity is merely a piece of stone is utterly or eternally condemned, or that should persons, I think that should be such persons, or that such persons should be despised, but rather that anyone who desires their own ultimate well-being should not perform worship with the idea that the deity is merely a piece of stone, and instead should worship the deity with the understanding of the deity taught in the aforesaid verses and commentaries, the essence of which is that the deity is to be regarded as a visibly manifest form of Bhagavan himself, who has appeared before a bhakta by Bhagavan's profound graciousness for the bhakta's ultimate spiritual well-being. So, that concludes our discussion on this topic. So from here, we'll go to the next phrase in the verse, which talks about as there was this inapt way of seeing the deity, so also there can be an inapt way of seeing the guru. So now we'll look at what the Shastras condemn as well as what they teach in regarding to how the guru is to be conceived. And as you can predictably expect, even if people have this wrong attitude about the guru, they can still gradually benefit and still gradually learn how to acquire the right attitude and ultimately succeed on the path. So that's what I have for today. So in sum, that the kind of critical point that it all hinges on ultimately is this idea that Vaishnavas will look favorably upon people who lack the proper understanding or who lack the proper conduct, because they'll ultimately see that those very phenomenon, just whatever is happening in the world, whatever is going on, they'll ultimately see the presence of Bhagavan within that. They'll ultimately see the opportunity to serve Bhagavan and by way of being kind and supportive of others in those contexts. So by virtue of their bhakti to Bhagavan, they will be filled with, what in some cases the Bhagavatam calls Jiva Vatsalya, or this compassionate or affectionate attitude towards other living beings, which is said to be a natural quality that emerges in the heart of someone who has bhakti to Bhagavan, which is quite natural if one feels oneself to be showered with an infinity of love from Bhagavan himself. If Bhagavan's love for his bhaktas is one of his primary virtues, and his virtues are known to produce chamadkar, or astonishment to the most profound degree, and if a bhakta feels even a little bit of that ultimately astonishing love that Bhagavan has for them, then when they turn around and interact with people who haven't had that experience or have had a lesser experience of that and feel themselves to be so blessed, so fortunate to receive that love that it's beyond anything they could ever deserve, beyond anything they could ever earn, and more wonderful than they could ever dream. And that the potential to receive that is also there in all these other people, and the only thing inhibiting that is their own ignorance or their own unfavorable samskars that obstruct that type of exchange from happening. Then how could those bhaktas not, turn or treat, in a favorable or a kind way? If they themselves have received love to such a profound extent, then at least they'll show some due regard for the well-being of others. This is a most natural effect of having been profoundly blessed, of having been profoundly graced, of having been a recipient of profound affection and love. Just as in ordinary contexts of the world, people who are raised with loving parents are the people who are kind to strangers and the people who are kind to their own children and kind to other people because they've received kindness, they've received love. Then they know the value of giving that, and they see the, so to speak, the poverty of those who lack that. So that Vaishnavas will have this type of forgiving and encouraging or well-wishing attitude towards others. This is very, very natural and very, very central to the experience of both having bhakti for Bhagavan and receiving Bhagavan's grace, receiving Bhagavan's love. So that love of Bhagavan then is at the very core of all of these things that, as we discussed or it was referred to in one of the recent classes on the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, the effect of prema is such that one can't not see the object of prema. When one really has prema for Bhagavan, one can't not see Bhagavan to be present in and through and around and of whatever one is experiencing. So, in such a context, that graciousness of Bhagavan that he showers upon his bhaktas and that they thus can't forget, and that thus pervades their vision and thus enriches the quality of their relations to all of the pervaded elements of Bhagavan. In other words, the people, the places, the things of the world that is the set, if you will, in which they're having this ongoing experience of Bhagavan's love and grace and various manifestations. Then that will be the generating force or the flow that will bring the spiritual well-being throughout human society and the positive waves, if you will, into the intercultural space. So anyway, without going excessively broad, I'll conclude here. And if anyone would like to make any comments, offer questions, corrections, or otherwise, please feel free. Yes.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay. So regarding this saragrahi quality, does it also apply to oneself? Meaning this quality of seeing one's own good qualities as opposed to one's imperfections.
Yeah, I mean within a healthy scope, definitely.
Yeah, so it's just general quality that goes out and in as well.
Absolutely.
Except forgiving as well, right?
Right. If you're too hard on yourself or all of this, obviously it won't be healthy for yourself. So, a good balance. And
because I'm referring to all this very commonly used phrase, "Oh, you're fallen servant," or "you're fallen this, fallen that." Like, it doesn't really cut in if you talk about saragrahi quality.
It depends on how and from what perspective someone is saying that. If someone, those type of remarks we see made by Thakur Mahashai and so many Mahatmas in their poetry. So, there can be a healthy way where that's said out of a hankering of longing for more, but if it's said in an unhealthy way out of a lack of regard for any quality or value within oneself, then certainly, there can be a way that might not be, favorable to make that type of remark.
Thank you. And also this adara quality, it's you mentioned adara, right? Like general disrespect of attitude.
Yeah, anadar would be a lack of regard or a lack of respect.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So can you say more about it? How you describe this quality?
Well, I was referring to this this statement of Jiva Gosvami, where we covered it in some previous class. I don't remember which one, but let me see if I just pull it up here really quick. If I can get the exact original statement. Yeah, here, Jiva Gosvami, this is in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he says, Aparadas tu sarve anadar atmaka eva. That all aparadas are anadar atmaka, or they're constituted of, or the basis of them is anadar, or a lack of regard, a lack of respect. So we don't, what is it that allows us to offend something? It's thinking that, or not having the idea that we should treat it well. If we lack the understanding of it being worthy or requiring care and honor, then that is the basis of us treating it with the opposite. So that's the point he was making.
Would we say that this dhara anadara is quality of dharma? Does it list somewhere there?
Sorry, when you say list somewhere...
The quality of... yeah, well, dharma has particular...
I don't know if you dropped out there. I didn't hear the last thing.
Set of contacts. Yeah, I'm going to forest, so maybe... so what I'm saying is that is this quality anadara part of dharma, as it is described? Dharma describes set of contacts and behaviors. Is this anadara part of those qualities, or lack of qualities, referring to dharma?
When you say dharma, do you mean like Bhagavad-dharma or karma marg, or...
Oh no, it's karma marg. Both, actually both, yeah, because both requires some type of behavior, right? Proper behavior, right? So if the proper behavior is described, then it also carries some a description of improper behavior, and anadara will be one of those.
Right.
And my question is whether this quality is also listed or discussed on dharma path, whether Bhagavad-dharma or karma, just regular dharma,
Okay. Well, I'd have to look for an exact example that uses that exact word, but I would say that, for example, for one case would be the qualities of Vaishnavas that we discussed in Madhya 22 some time back. Among those qualities, you would definitely find, the quality of being a saragrahin, or being one who appreciates quality. Oh, sorry, the line cut. Sorry, one sec. Oh dear. Okay, sorry about that. So I was just saying that among the qualities of Vaishnavas that we hear listed in the Bhagavatam and the Charitamrita, the quality of having, quote, adar, or of having due regard for others, would definitely be found there. So the general attitude that would negate or preclude the presence of anadar, or a lack of respect for others, would be absent. For example, in the Trinadupi Sunechana verse, the statement is made, manada, be respectful, be giving of respect. So that's listed as a quality of a Vaishnava. So that itself would imply that the person understands that people are worthy of respect. In other words, we won't interpret the teaching, be respectful, to mean, okay, it's just teaching people to engage in formalities without understanding why. We would understand that if the teaching is to be respectful, then the teaching would imply both understanding the respectability of the other, as well as practically demonstrating that in one's behavior. So in the, from that we can say on the path of Bhagavad-dharma, the presence or the idea of having, adar buddhi, or a respectful attitude towards others, is certainly enjoined or described as a quality of Vaishnavas. And elsewhere, in the broader context of the path of karma, then, to have the eligibility for karma also implies faith in the injunctions of the Shastra, and the Shastra enjoins, respectfulness towards other beings. As part of the conduct of following the path of karma, there's prohibitions against harming, of committing hingsa. There are injunctions to show respect to elders or show respect to teachers and all of these things. So we would say that in the general path of karma, there's certainly teachings about the value and necessity of having a respectful attitude, and in the path of bhakti, it's also there.
Thank you. Yeah, just want to hear that admiration. It's just interesting topic because it's like, it's a prelude to actually sadhana, is it not?
I would say so. In other words, to do the activity, there has to be the perception that inspires the activity, or, which is, when I say there has to be, it means that to do it in its fullness. Like you can see it all throughout Indian culture. I can say, as someone who's a quote unquote, Maharaj in the, eyes of common people, I don't know how many hundreds of houses I've gone to, and you come in and then the parents go and bring the kids and then tell the kids, Namaskar koro, like show respect to the Maharaj, and it's like, I'm sitting there, it's like, obviously it doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm just wearing a cloth, I'm just wearing a hat, I'm just playing this role in the movie, and the the parents are trying to teach the kids. So you can see that the kids, they don't, who is a Maharaj, what is a sadhu, what is Shastra, what is Siddhanta, what is Bhav, what is Bhakti, like, they have no idea, they're 4 years old, you know what I mean? Like, they have no idea, but they're being told, like, make this physical gesture of touching the feet, or touching the floor, or of joining the palms, or whatever, and then they're doing that. Sometimes, sometimes the naughty kids are running off in the other room, or, acting like they don't understand. And then other kids you can just see in their body language, they're just doing what their parents are telling them. There's no feeling, there's no understanding, there's no genuine attitude or feeling of respect, but they're learning how to make this gesture, and they're acquiring this knowledge that this gesture is symbolic of respect. So that's a deep part of the Indian culture, is to do the activity even if it's without the understanding, or even if it's without the bhav. But then, sometimes in those same houses, you'll meet or I've had the experience many times of meeting, let's say, the grandpa of the kid who's being told by the parents to bow down, and then the person who's far elder than you comes and actually bows down to you. And whoever it is, this has nothing, I'm not talking about myself in any way. But when you see that, you realize this person also is not like respecting me. This person has faith in Shastra, this person has faith in Bhagavan, this person has faith in Vaishnavas, this person is showing respect out of their own realization of these ideals that they aspire to. And again, I'm just, the actor in the play here. And so that, where the person is, they don't even need to do that because culturally speaking, they might be the elder, they might not be obligated. But when they do it anyway, because they have realization of the relishability and the value and the beauty of making physical gestures that express the spiritual vision and the feelings that emerge from having that spiritual vision of other people in their society or in their community, that's respect. That's a gesture that's an emerging from an education and a realization and a feeling. So that's ideal, or in other words, that's, you could say, a true gesture of respect, where it's both physically performed and emerging from an intellectual and emotional wealth. And compared to the kid who has no idea what he's doing and he's just making a gesture because his parents are forcing him to do it, So, this is a very simple example, but I'm just saying that that distinction if we look back at the, Mahaprabhu says, Manadena Kirtaniya Sada Hari, chant the name of Krishna showing respect to others. Then, the 4-year-old kid says, Hari Bol, and shyly bows, joins their palms, doing these two things that they really don't understand. They're just replicating a form, versus some elder person who's in the maturity of their life, who out of their own life of following the path of bhakti genuinely feels joy and regard for the presence of a Vaishnava and can see and respect Vaishnavas, even if you're not a Vaishnava, even if you're just wearing the cloth that a Vaishnava wears, they still feel joy, even in showing respect, just based on the guise of a Vaishnava. And they can speak the name of Bhagavan out of, a feeling of regard for who Bhagavan is, of his qualities, of his leelas, of his majesty, of his madhurya, etc., etc. So when the scripture teaches us chant showing respect, obviously it ultimately means the form that's emerging from education and realization and emotion and all of this, but it also includes the formality of the person who's in the very elementary stage and is blessed to get the chance to even meet sadhus or know how to show a formal respect that they don't understand. So ideally, that's why we spend all this time studying these texts and hearing all these commentaries, so that we can acquire the vision that can lead to the experience that can give rise to a fullness of these gestures or a fullness of these activities that will ultimately be, anubhavas or, effects of what is relished and felt at the heart, rather than just something that's done as an attempt to try to experience something.
Something formulaic or performance style behavior.
Yeah, there's a place for it. It's a stage, but it's not an end in itself.
Baba, at once you have mentioned, you refer me to essay by some writer about respect. What's respect and what's the honor? And their conclusion was that human being deserves to respect. by its own constitution, human being requires, or not requires, but deserves a respect. And I think it's very interesting to connect these two, because this is that completes actually the reason why would you respect, right? And I was wondering if Shastra, I mean, of course we know that Bhagavan is everyone's heart, so in this way respect everyone, knowing that fact. But also the quality of human being, to recognize a human being as a very special and human life deserves to be respected because of its own uniqueness. That's also quite supportive in developing that Adar quality, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. There's something philosophical and also something, I would say, emotional and slash, I don't know how to name it, the way of appreciating reality as being divine, actually. To understand the human life, actually, it's a divine life at the foundation. There are different forms of life, human existence are really low and high, but the foundation of human existence is that profound divinity that stands behind, to give the chance of Jiva to actually recognize its own existence, recognize Bhagavan, and do meaningful forward steps. I'm talking about in very general outshell, and I'm talking about philosophy of Vaishnavism, but in general, to recognize that human form as being very, it's actually divine, very special expression of divinity that helps actually to develop that, maintain that respect, as opposed to just learning, formulas and theorizing about it, or just, because Shastra says so, which is also based on faith. But, I think that the understanding, as you mentioned, that the respect with understanding is actually what is required in order to avoid offenses.
Absolutely. I'll just, as a tiny comment to that, I'll just add that it reminds me of that verse in the 11th canto where the Purush manifested all the different life forms and didn't feel satisfied, and then manifested the human form that has Brahmavalokana-dishana, the intellect by which the absolute can be perceived, and then became satisfied.
It's like a little biblical verse, is it not? It's something like a Bible verse. The God wasn't happy with creation, but he created man, and then he was happy. Right. Yeah, and this, which country is that?
That's 11.9.38, I believe, or 11.9.28.
I see. Fantastic. Thank you. This is very nice elaboration. I mean, this is something that we should actually discuss more often, I think, because it's at the foundation of sadhana, is it not?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just the foundation of every interaction we have with every human being in our life. If we really feel regard for humanity, for human life itself, on top of that, for the pervading presence of Bhagavan within everyone, if we really have ongoing deep feeling for that, how many rich, sweet interactions can we have all throughout our life, just even in the midst of the most ordinary exchanges?
Right. And in this way, our whole life becomes a sadhana, is it not?
That's the whole point, is that, Vaishnavism isn't just this abstraction that you just do in your locked room for a couple hours and then go out to the material world and do something else, but it's how you see and how it pervades every single thought and action all the time.
Right.
And I think a lot of bhaktas who have that kind of dualistic thinking, they a lot of times feel frustrated or trapped or stressed by all this otherness, but that otherness is actually just a function of seeing it that way. If you see it as integrated rather than, not part of the ritualized, quote unquote, practices of bhakti, if you see that kind of distinction too sharply, then you end up just missing out on so much opportunity to culture this faith and culture this path all the time, everywhere.
Right. And just comes to mind now, one of the person that gives spiritual instructions, he says, the most important is to maintain kindness towards others. Just be kind, and you'll be fine. I found it very simplistic, but it just keeps you in a safe track, I think, in a general way, very general way.
Sure. I mean, according to the recent verses, this whole, who is the kanishta, the person who doesn't see the Bhagavan in anyeshu, in others,
Yes.
And who is the uttam bhagavat, sarva bhutani yapushyat, who sees Bhagavan in everyone and everyone in Bhagavan. So, the whole gradation is the extent to which Bhagavan is imminently perceived and recognized to be in the field of your interaction. So the more the merrier, the more his presence is understood and conceived and integrated into one's dealings with all living beings, the better. And how do you practically act on that? By being good to people, by doing what is of the benefit for whoever you're with, whether it's a tree or a rock or a human being. I mean, to me, it ultimately has ecological implications as well. It's not just like a human cultural thing, and then like God's not present in the animals and the birds and the insects and the microbes and everywhere else too. Ultimately, to really live that, we have to have a lifestyle that respects and positively integrates with every single feature of the environment.
Sorry, I'm not juggling on this, but can respect be disassociated from affection?
Yeah, definitely.
Can be. Okay, so it can be more like intellectual kind of approach, as opposed to like really, I feel from my heart, I really love people, I really respect them because I have affection for those people, for every form of life. Like, I love animals, I love people, and, in a sense of not loving, tree hogging, but in a sense of like, I have deep appreciation for them, for what they are. Like having affection for people, like feeling some, not empathy, but like, have this empathetic, we call it, affection basically for people. That actually solidifies this respect.
Yeah, I mean, to get into the subtleties of love, affection, respect, there's some gradation in all these terms, and obviously in English, they can have different connotations for different people that may or may not map onto certain terms and comments made in our, Goswami works, and, that's kind of, could be an elaborate discussion, but what I could say generally is that most fundamental, whether you call it affection or whether you call it respect or whatever you call it, that you care about the well-being of the other. Because there can also be respect that's like anti-affection, In other words, like you can say, I worship Gomata, I do puja to cows on Go Puja Day. And then you can also, do so many things or buy so many products that lead to the killing of cows. So it's like, I respect. I even do puja, but you like also kill, So it's like, is this really respect? Is this really puja? So, to me, whether you call it respect or you call it love or whatever you want to call it, that you act in a way that leads to the well-being of the other. Because someone might come and say, oh, you're so nice, and have a garland and have a cookie, and I'll praise you and tell you you have nice rupa and guna and blah, 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 blah. But then if that person, after they do that, like commits violence to me, or, like physically harms me or something, like, what do I care about whatever gestures they made if the net exchange that I have with them is that I end up in pain, right? So better than like even making some nice gestures or speaking some flowery words, ultimately to act in a way that leads to the well-being that is actually felt to will be well-being by the other. That's the bottom line, And if someone acts in a way to me that truly leads to my well-being, if they, gave me a flower as they did so or not, that doesn't matter to me that much. You know what I mean? So that's, and as I see, like the core of it all, that if we're going to honor Bhagavan, if we're going to honor others by virtue of the presence of Bhagavan in them, then how do we truly respect or honor or love anyone? The fundamental basis is to understand the needs, understand the well-being of the other, and act in a way that's conducive to that. And then on top of that, to do so according to social or ecological norms as to how that is ideally shown or, commonly done according to culture or circumstance, or if it's possible to do it in a spirit of affection and richness and all of that, then all the more the merrier, But to me, when you get into showing respect and affection without that groundedness in actually caring about and seeing to the well-being of the other, that's when the cultural forms and the cultural norms can become hollow and ultimately like kind of smoky or illusory, so to speak, where you can get this hollow sense of being good, but you're not actually really doing what really matters. And I personally believe that all religious traditions and all these things, they should ultimately pay out at the bottom line. Like, they should ultimately have a net benefit effect on society that's good, that's measurable, not just by the members of that group, because there can be a tendency to think anything done in the name of this tradition with this set of norms and customs is good. But whether it's really good or not, will ultimately be recognizable and perceivable even to people outside that self-referential set of terms and norms and customs. And in my opinion, anyway. Yeah. So to me, that's like a platform. And then on top of that, depending on how well we know people, depending on this, the norms, the who we are, the social roles we have, the way we're related, then the richer, the better in terms of gestures of respect or affection or what have you.
Yeah, thank you. It just remember my uncle. Once I had to talk with him privately, and he says, he said, I think life is meant for service. And he's example of that, that he always looks after others' benefits, And I really appreciate it, Very special.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Reminds me, the motto of my high school was, be a person for others. Yes. That was like the teaching they gave at all the main assemblies and all that. So similar.
Oh, thank you. This is very nice discussion.
Well, your participation enriches it greatly, so thank you.
My pranam too. No, you're inspired so much. Thank you.
All right, well, we're a little over time today. I'll sign off here. And if we're so blessed, then in our next session, we'll dive into the next step in our discussion of the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Pranam, Jai Radhe.